We can see power, particularly coercive power, at a smaller level in terms of material culture if we look at warfare. The technology that they had is actually quite hard for us to ascertain because guess what? We're back with our preservation issues for this material culture. We know from written sources, and as you can see here in the bottom right, some illuminated manuscripts as well, the kind of tools they had for warfare, like siege towers, which were also called belfries. They had the trebuchet, which was the counterweight catapult. And the mangonel, which was the torsion catapult, but it's very hard to tell when transitions were made between the trebuchet and the mangonel and when each was used based on manuscript images because they're rather vague. Now, this one on the bottom right, that does look like a trebuchet, but that's unusually clear. There were also other things like the crossbow, or the longbow, as well as simple tools like the battering ram. Now, a lot of the time, we can't identify these in terms of surviving material culture because they're made out of wood. And this will have impacted the areas in which this type of military technology was used because, as we know, deforestation was an ongoing problem throughout the Middle Ages, and the kind of wood that you need to make these items is high quality wood. It's the same kind of wood you make for boats or for houses, so it would have been expensive and high status as well. Where we will find, and actually if you're excavating like castle sites, we often find the metal parts that were fired from bows, so the arrowheads made out of metal, those pitch up pretty common. By the time we hit the gunpowder era, we find musket balls. So many musket balls. And we can tell if the musket balls have been fired or not because they are round little lead balls, and if they've been fired and they hit something, they tend to have a flat bit on one side where they had impact. But otherwise, the wooden parts are very, very rare to find. They also used very simple but effective means. Sieges were common, and therefore a lot of sieges were broken when simply somebody was bribed to open the gate and let them in, rather than attacking using any of these trebuchets or mangonels, etc. Because they also, as well as being expensive, difficult to construct, you really need to know what you were doing, they were not very accurate and probably not that impactful either. So simple things like bribery, but also tunneling would have been preferred. We will probably have limited material evidence for sappers. Sappers were the people who were the professional tunnel diggers. It was also a very risky occupation. So we're looking for metal parts, which we find for crossbows and for muskets. We might also hope to find some armour, particularly the chainmail, which is known, the bit of chainmail that covers the body is called a hauberk. Here are some contemporary images. That's generally still, though, our best use for knowing what kind of weaponry they had. So chainmail predates the plate armour. It was very, very heavy, if you can imagine the weight of all these links of steel put together. Very expensive too. Would have been very heavy, but more movable than plate armour. The helmets changed over time too. They got more complex. They had a nose piece up for most of the High Middle Ages, but then over time they got heavier with a visor. The surcoat, which is what this guy on the right is wearing, the piece of cloth with identifying marks, that developed in the early 12th century. Kind of strange in many ways that it didn't develop before then, because otherwise how would you tell who you're fighting against sometimes? Because of, well, the bad F word, feudalism, to what extent did it exist? Yeah, okay, fine. But the emphasis is on knights and therefore cavalry. That's why this guy on the right has a very angry looking horse behind him. So the knights were a heavy mounted cavalry. Their terms of being like successful guerrilla tactics, not so much. These guys were heavy and they charged, and they were not very movable or necessarily terribly versatile because of the weight of all their accoutrements. The shield, I don't have a picture here of the shield because this guy at the very top of the bio tapestry, and he's got a barrel rather than a shield, or maybe it's a shield wrapped up in something. But the shield would have been kite-shaped to begin with, and that would have been done to cover the body as much as possible. But it became smaller over time as mail and then plate armor became more effective at covering the body. Actually, if you look carefully at this bio tapestry image, you'll see that the servants are carrying swords, and that weird bit in between them is actually chainmail. But if you look above and right to their heads, they're actually carrying helmets. Looks by the nose piece, so that kind of stereotypical Norman helmet to protect the nose. Sorry, there's a train going past. You probably can hear it. So there were advantages but also disadvantages to this type of weaponry technology and in warfare in the Middle Ages more generally. Advantages, main one, destructive. Oh yes, here, oh no, that's not, that's a surcoat on a horse. This was a kite-shaped shield, but it's actually a surcoat on a horse, so ignore me. As you can see, pretty long list of disadvantages. This is very cumbersome. Even the armor is very cumbersome. These people charging up the ladder, and it could be as simple as a ladder, are in mail. And the archers are in mail, but even then, they are not likely to be very versatile fighters. It's also, as I said, not very accurate. Also, those, to flick back to our trebuchet and mangonel, if you look at how they're constructed, you need flat ground to put them on, and we can see that in this bottom image as well. The trebuchet is on flat ground, even if like the manuscript makes it look like there's sort of a hilly area between it and the castle or town that it's attacking. They're also very expensive, and you needed specialists, what we would later call engineers, to build, but they don't call them engineers in the Middle Ages. Certainly very skilled carpenters because of the sheer size, and multiple ones as well. It's not like an individual could put this together. As I've just said, it's made of wood. Wood is hard to find, but the other thing is that it's easy to burn. So this means that medieval military technology was very much dependent on the landscape. So going right back to the beginning of the semester. They were extremely expensive. If you were going to could use the whole range of materials that were available to you, you needed a strong tax base to support. And most kings, and especially lords, did not have this guaranteed income. Yeah, they're all relying from agriculture at some point and a small amount of trade, as we know. One of the links that is going to appear after this video is to the Museum of London. They have a really cool archaeology service. Also, you can click on the scabbards and sheaths that I linked to. There's also a link there that says click on related objects, and I would recommend that you go and do that. The link is very unwieldy otherwise for me to link to. As it says, there's an unusually good level of weapon finds from London because of the anaerobic conditions. So they actually do have the material culture to reflect that. So a lord will have spent a lot of money, well, not necessarily on siege equipment, but a lord and a knight, one of their biggest investments will have been their chainmail or their plate armor, their helmet, their horse, and all of these particular items. So therefore, these items are the material culture that most prominently display their martial identity. They use this material culture as a power display, and they perform and use it to reinforce their power. In medieval warfare, though, there was what we call a campaigning season. You only went to war at certain times of the year. If you think about it, a lord might have very limited interest in his manor, but his way of life is supported by the manor. Therefore, he would not want to be away from home during a harvest. That's when most of his income is going to develop from. Also, the planting in spring, he's not going to be away from. Winter, not going to want to be away because horrible weather. So this limits the times of year when warfare could be conducted. Indeed, most military service in the Middle Ages was already determined and set at 40 days. This means that warfare in the Middle Ages was not constant. If we think about the likes of the 100 Years' War, that was not fought constantly for 100 years or 114 years as it actually was. Instead, wars tend to fluctuate, and they tend to be fought during the campaigning season, and then they break up, and then they all come back. And that's partly why they last for so long, because any advances they made during campaigning season, they risk losing in the much longer period of year when they're not actually away fighting. So what did lords do when they weren't at war? Because if it's 40 days, they were expected to hit the ground running. And if you think about having to carry a shield and a sword and be an effective fighter while lugging all of this weighty metal stuff, you needed to be physically very fit to do that. You also needed a lot of training. So it isn't like the lords could just pick up what they were doing at the end of 40 days. They needed to be consistently training. This taps into lordly spare time. That taps into a way for them to keep their skills up. So we find two particular fondnesses of lords in the Middle Ages to do this: hunting and tournaments. Also, there's a performative aspect to this. Hunting and tournaments, people are going to see it. It's going to reinforce their power over other people, over the landscape also. So firstly, how they displayed their power over the landscape, let's have a look at hunting. Oh, actually, no, I'm going to take that back. I'm going to first stop on tournaments, which I'm not going to tell you very much about, actually, because I have pasted, there's a page in your Moodle, and this has got more information for you on tournaments. There's a set of primary sources, which are letters, written in England, calling different lords to come for a tournament. Then there's another link, which is the rules of jousting. And spoiler alert, you did not realize it was this complicated. And then the last link ties back to, well, I wouldn't say material culture necessarily, that's your kind of skeleton as material culture, but it talks about the wounds that we can see that knights and lords have when we from their osteology, from their bones. So those four items go together very well, and then that'll link through to a question for you to answer here on Nearpod. But I put this slide in, even though you'll read it mainly yourself, because these are nice manuscript images for illustrating what you're going to be reading about. So you might want to keep these pictures open while you're reading the primary sources. Okay, now we go on to hunting, because we can see this command, the power over the landscape, in the form of deer parks. When we talk about hunting, a lord was particularly thinking about hunting for deer. So the deer, it's keeping the military skills up, it's establishing power and dominion. But also venison was only allowed to be eaten by lords, so it was also reinforcing lordly identity through food consumption. They gave venison as gifts, so gift giving. Feasts, they would have been prime part of feasts, and we know that feasts performed in the hall, public space, lots of power and symbolism there as well. So a deer park would have been on a lord's wish list, and saying that, it would have been very, very expensive. So really, if you were a lord, you wanted to be buddies with a friend who had a deer park. But as this manuscript image on the right shows, while we immediately think of hunting in terms of deer, it could have been on lower scale as well. Here are women practicing their archery skills. And we can tell that they were doing this in the deer park because there's two deer looking on suspiciously and one who's just too busy eating, as well as some ducks minding their own business. So while it's women in this image, men would have also practiced these skills, and they wouldn't have needed as much space to do it. Deer parks, though, required a lot more investment and business. We find the best known ones are the royal forests. Now, I'm saying about forests, and in this picture, it's kind of reinforcing that. If you look at the back of this picture, there's deer hiding amongst the trees. And we hear forests and we think trees. But in the Middle Ages, the term forest is not necessarily describing the land use or the land cover, but rather the legal right held to the lands. In the case of royal forests, it's going to be the king or queen's legal right over this land. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's woodland at all. So when we're talking about the Middle Ages, it's much clearer when we're talking about forested areas, as we would mean it today, to say woodland, because forest has a legal meaning. Up to a quarter of land in England was crown forest, and this was land that was reserved for hunting by the king. And because it was a legal entity, doesn't necessarily reflect how much woodland there was. Indeed, there were villages and farming within a forest. But the king could come charging over with his buddies and hunt on your land, as was his royal prerogative, and thus he sort of exercised his power over the ordinary people. One of the big names, if you remember when we talked about woodland in the countryside, is Oliver Rackham. He reckoned that by the late 14th century, only around 2% of land in England was actually a deer park, like a actual defined hunting area. But even though it's only 2%, it had a disproportionate social impact on the countryside because they were material power displays. Hunting, a lordly pursuit, very, very sought after, and you needed a license to create your own deer park in England, so it remained an exclusive ability. We can actually find these licenses to empark along with the license to crenellate. A license to crenellate was the license that you applied for from the king, that you theoretically needed to go and build your castle. So it's estimated by the late 13th century that probably no more than 20% of elite families owned a park. So it wasn't something that you could have had as a lord unless you were extremely wealthy. So it's kind of like an extra way for a lord to materially display I'm more powerful than other lords. We think that the park as a defined area for hunting didn't emerge until the 12th century. And it tends to be associated with secular lords. We don't really find ecclesiastics doing this. Not really their scene, I suppose. They might also be referred to, forests are associated with deer, but of course they might be associated, just termed as park, not even quantified as a deer park. And there are many, many types of land, even within the lordly deer parks. There could be heathland, fenland. There could be not just, random trees, but fruit trees, orchards. As this picture shows, there's a deer hanging out by a duck pond, but it's probably not duck pond, it's probably a fish pond, so they'll have got fish out of that. Areas of tillage even. Because for a high medieval lord, the ability to control a wide range of resources was a demonstration of power and wealth. So by putting all of these into the miniature world of the park, that's conveying a message to the people who could see it. And if you think about it, lords are practicing their skills, their military skills, they're doing it on horseback. You're not going to get really good rampaging around on horseback in dense forest cover, like in this manuscript image here. It's going to make hunting difficult. So you would want different types of landscape. Usually that means that the legal definition of a forest is going to be much, much bigger than the actual place where the deer were. So the deer park had a lot of significance to medieval people because while I said, you could have different forms of landscape, you could even have tillage, that was not common. Most of the time, park land was removed from agriculture. That is significant too, because the lord is making a display that he is so wealthy and powerful, he can actually turn perfectly productive land over to another use, not just income generation. So therefore, people at the time, today we're talking about it abstractly, but in the Middle Ages, the medieval people would have taken this as a material sign of lordly authority. Oliver Rackham called them the supreme status symbol. So it is also, as I said, closely linked with hospitality. It's an entertainment opportunity for your guests and as a food source. As to the number and size of these deer parks, we're making educated guesswork. It's estimated that in England by the year 1300 there were maybe 3,200 deer parks constructed, and these were all constructed by lords, but of a range of backgrounds, from magnates down to minor lords. Most of them fell within the size range of between 40 acres and 250 acres, though smaller and larger parks existed. Then that's the numbers I've given you here. Smallest 30 acres, in which case you're not going to be able to do very much charging about on horseback. Probably a minor lord constructed that. The biggest were 4,300 acres. Now that is a real social statement. In terms of identifying them materially, they tended to be lobe-shaped in plan. That's what this image on the right shows. And as you can see, this has got a wall all the way around it. And that's because they needed to be secure to keep the deer within them. You don't want to lose your deer, they're very expensive. So that means that if we try very hard, we can still identify deer parks in the modern day landscape. First off, we might look for the legal definition to give us a hint, and then we might look for signs of having been enclosed. Rackham says, in England, the parks were often close to where the king or the higher lords had lands or palaces, particularly those if they had multiple properties where they spent most of their time, which makes sense. We might also look for the documentation of these licenses to empark to identify them. But if we're talking about the physical manifestation, they're often demarcated by a wide, high earthen bank with a ditch on either side of it. While this example on the right from manuscript has got a stone wall, and you can see it's got these what we call crenellations along the top, which is a form of castle architecture. So think about the message this person is trying to send. You didn't need to have a stone wall. You could have had a wooden palisade atop the bank. But you could add a stone wall as well, just much, much more expensive. Many deer parks were then divided internally to aid in the management of the deer and to prevent parts of the deer park being overgrazed or poached, so hence the lobe-shaped. Or they could be rectangles or square with rounded corners. By the 14th century, we find the English kings liked to be much more fancy with their deer parks, so that they could have their residences completely surrounded by parkland. So everywhere they looked, they could see it and be reminded of their own power. Ideally, the boundary of the park ran just below the brow of a hill, and this would be so that the deer could jump into any enclosures, like the park, but due to the ditch and the uphill direction of the slope, could not jump back out. So the goal was that over time, you maximize the amount of deer within the park, so that they can jump in, but they can't come back out. The great magnates and the royalties, we've got a huge range in the size, but the average for the more important lords was around 1,000 acres, if not more. They often made use of natural boundaries like rivers to form boundaries as well. So in terms of identifying the landscape today, that's where we start. But the physical remains, a lot of times they've completely disappeared. But some of them have continued in use from the Middle Ages, particularly if they're in later lordly continued occupied estates. So we might find the former parks if we look for stretches of banks, bank and ditch systems or walls. But we might also look for boundaries, parish boundaries, often copy part of a park boundary, perimeter, because parks were usually off on a more peripheral part of the manor, not like the dovecot slap bang in the centre of a manor. And the trees and shrubs that you still see today can be useful indicators of former parkland too, because you might find ancient hedgerows, finding the boundaries, or evidence for coppicing or pollarding, which we talked about several weeks ago when we talked about land use. within the parks. If you find stands of them, oh, there's been park management here. Parkers' lodges were usually situated at high points in the landscape so that the park could easily be observed. So we might look for building remains, but we can also see it in place name evidence, like the use of terms like Old Lodge Farm, that usually implies medieval usage, or even just the word park in a place name. Sometimes that's far too general, but actually the likes of Fiona Beglin have made a study in Ireland and used the park place name to find that actually, yeah, there's quite a lot of overlap. Whether it's post-medieval or medieval is the question. So really, if we're identifying the material remains of these hunting landscapes, we're looking for place names, we're looking for documentary references, and we're looking for some physical remains also. Why do we go to this effort? Well, there's an increased recognition that these are high status manorial features and that they are linked closely to elite identity, martial identity, and power displays. So this is the last video. You now have got the primary sources to read about tournaments and the questions answer about that, and then the flip grid to discuss all the materials for this week.